Hey, and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to talk to you about the second most common mistake I see people make on their healing journey. And that second mistake that I see people make is that they get obsessed with self-help books, podcasts, blogs, you name it, they get obsessed. And I know because I made that mistake myself. I felt like I wasn't getting what I needed from the therapist because she was really good at labeling me and saying like, oh, you're codependent or you're anxious or you suffer from childhood emotional neglect. And the tools and strategies she was giving me weren't really helpful. So when it came to codependency, she said, oh, carry a can of invisible cooking spray in your pocket and spray that on yourself every time you feel like the strings of codependency are attaching to you. And that would have been great if I, A, had the awareness of being codependent, and B, if I was good at visualizing, because at that time I wasn't meditating, I wasn't visualizing, I wasn't doing any kind of that work to be able to just whip that strategy right out of my invisible toolbox and use it. The other strategy she gave me was carry invisible scissors in your pocket and then snip the strings of codependency away when you feel them attaching. Again, maybe great in theory, but not really great in true life application because I had to be aware and I had to remember to get those scissors out and snip away the strings of codependency. So when I got that label of codependency, I thought, okay, great, this is my ticket to being healed. So if you have that same thought, make sure you watch my video. I'll link it here in this show for you about how labels are not really the answer to our healing journey. So I became obsessed with the label of codependency, and every time something didn't go right or I felt like I fucked up, I would say, oh, it's because I'm codependent. And so I thought, okay, if I'm going to use this invisible cooking spray, or if I'm going to use these invisible scissors, I have to learn everything there is to learn about codependency. So I started just getting every resource I could, mostly from Melody Beattie, because I'll say she is the codependency expert, the guru, so to speak. She is the one who has laid the foundation around work for codependency. She has several books, she has journals, she has a daily devotional book. She did a lot with AA in the beginning, and that's where her codependency work comes in. And so I have literally a stack of papers still to this day, 10 years later in a binder, about all the things codependency, how it happens, why it happens, what you do when you're codependent, what other people do when you're codependent with them, and how to break that. And here's the thing. I read every single book she has. I read Codependency No More. I read I read her first codependency book. I read the second codependency book. I got the journal. And I still felt like that wasn't enough. I was like, oh my gosh, there's still more to learn about codependency. I have to learn more. I have to learn more. So I went and I started checking other resources out from the library about codependency and started binging those and taking more notes. And I bought another journal about codependency. And guess what? Nothing about the codependency was changing because there was no accountability there. And it was just a lot of factual information. It was a lot of learning, but I was having a really hard time applying that to my current existence. And so I was just learning, but there was no application. I couldn't make the connection of when I was being codependent and doing the things in the book. I couldn't do it. And so then I became even more frustrated and more overwhelmed and more defeated because I had learned all of this stuff about codependency, but nothing was changing. So I thought, okay, that's fine. I'll start listening to podcasts. I'll start watching YouTube videos. I'll find blogs. And then the whammy was that not only was I codependent, but the therapist called me anxious. Do you consider yourself to be an anxious person? And I was like, no, I do not. But then the same thing happened all over again. She couldn't really give me any tools or strategies to stop the pattern of anxiety. And so then I became anxious about being anxious. And so I started doing all of this work, research really, no work, all research about anxiety and all the different types of anxiety. There's anxiety for if you get stuck thinking about things that will happen in the future. There's anxiety about things that you can't let go of from the past. Anxiety plays out in so many different ways. And so I found this really great online resource that was free that you could print out, and it was almost like a worksheet, and you could answer questions about anxiety, and almost like this little grid, like, okay, well, if this happens, then what will you do, and then what will happen, and then what will happen. And that was great at maybe like giving me some insight as to why the anxiety was happening, but there wasn't anything there for me to stop the anxiety. There wasn't anything there for me to say, okay, Kim, you're being anxious, stop. Let's figure out what's causing the anxiety, what's causing the anxious feelings. Let's do something to change that. Let's interrupt that pattern. Let's stop the trigger and move forward in a different way. It wasn't doing that for me. And then the same thing happened with childhood emotional neglect. She was like, do you know that you've been affected by childhood emotional neglect? And at that point, I did not. But as soon as she said those 3 words, childhood emotional neglect, I was like, oh, it makes perfect sense. Of course I have. I had parents who divorced when I was very young. I had parents who were emotionally unavailable because they were too busy dealing with their own trauma and nonsense that I sort of got left in the wayside. And so, it makes complete and total sense. And not having my emotions validated. And so then it was the same thing. It was podcasts, it was blogs, it was YouTube videos, it was books, it was doing inner child work from these books on my own. And I'll say that was probably the most impactful thing that I did in all of the binging of resources that I did. It was the most traction I made was the inner child work. But that's because there were actual steps to follow, things to do. But even still, when I was having an inner child moment and my inner child was triggered, I didn't have the coping skills to get through that. So there was work being done to heal the inner child, but I was having a 3-year-old inner child having temper tantrums, and it was really embarrassing because there I'm as an adult having a temper tantrum like a 3-year-old. And so I didn't get really anything from all of this binging. Every time I was in the car, I would put a podcast on, or I would listen to a YouTube video through Bluetooth because I didn't need to see what was going on. I just needed to hear it. And this was day in and day out for 2 years, almost 3 years. And I was still in the same exact place as I was before I started binging all of these things. So it really was not helpful. It was a huge mistake because it had me stuck on things that really were not the most important things. The labels didn't really matter. The meaning around the things mattered. The patterns around the things mattered. And so if I had actually been spending my time in other ways, then I would have been able to make more progress rather than going down this rabbit hole. Not to mention the amount of money I would have saved. I have so many books that I jokingly say I have more books than the self-help section at Barnes & Noble. And some of them I checked out of the library because I wanted to look at them first, but then read the whole thing and was like, wow, this is really amazing. And so then I bought it. And I can't tell you how many times I did that. Some of those books I read 3 and 4 times, and the more I read them, the angrier I got because I didn't see the answers that I needed. So I was like, okay, these people were able to overcome, but how come I can't? And it's because the books, the podcast, everything gives you the what and it gives you the why, but it wasn't giving me the how. And I so desperately needed the how that I was exhausting myself trying to find it. But if I had taken the what and I had taken the why and I had really gone deep with that, I had gone deep and gotten to the root of the problem, I would have been able to find the why so much easier, or not the why, the how. I would have been able to find the how so much easier. So the books gave me the what and the why. And if I had taken that information from those resources and I knew how to apply the how, I could have saved myself hours and hours and hours and hours of unnecessary note-taking, stress, frustration, hopelessness, depression, anxiety, all of these things that I was trying to get past. I was just perpetuating them because I was just doing the same thing over and over and over and over, which by definition is insanity. So please do not make the same mistake that I made. If you want to read a self-help resource, a book, a podcast, or a blog, great, but go into it with the right reason, the right intention, and that is to gain information about the what or the why. Do not go into it looking for the how because you're not going to get it. And chances are, if you do get the how from those resources, you're not going to be able to sustain it and maintain it because there's no one holding you accountable, and you might be able to recognize it for a little bit, but you're going to fall off the wagon because it's not how you normally operate. So just use the resources for what they're intended for. So if you found this video helpful, please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll see you on the next one.